Welcome back.
It's now 7 minutes away from 7 o'clock. And as promised before the break, we have brought in two economic experts to talk about a myriad of issues and to put them through some torture. No, I'm joking. We have Rumile, Arana, and Christopher McGann. Good morning, gentlemen, and welcome to the show.
Good morning, good morning.
Thank you, guys.
Now, the last time you were here, we did talk a little bit about watching global trends to see how they impact the local economy. And sometimes people want to immediately draw some of the correlations between what's happening outside Belize, whether it's in China or other places, to see how it will impact us. Is it always that straightforward when you're living in a developing country?
Most of the time, it's not a one-to-one correlation. A lot of the times with these relationships, you'll notice a lag, for example, that will happen in one period, and 1 to 2 periods down, then is when we'll begin to feel the lagging effects of the changes in these global prices or phenomenon, etc.
So with that said, we have fielded some questions. And one of the questions deals with the international price of oil. And it says it is at the lowest it has been in decades. If that's true, why am I paying so much at the pump? Shouldn't I be paying less to put fuel in my car if the government is paying less to bring it into the country?
Well, as Chris had mentioned, there is a lag effect in terms of the pass-through of international prices to our local prices here. And quite honestly, our oil prices have about 3 components. I mean, our gas prices.
Gas prices.
3 components is the transportation cost and the purchase cost of getting it here. That's one. Then there's the government's take, and then there is the sellers, the producers, their profits as well. So in our case, as I think towards the end of the year, there was a reduction in prices. There was an increase in prices, and people were complaining about, and then there are reductions. So it's the adjustment, we can see it happening. But before the increase that was as a result of the government's policy, we need to boost our revenues, seeing that we have lost revenues from the other side in terms of our oil production going down. So the government's take from there was lessened. So we needed more from other sources, and the gas prices was just another part of that.
Yeah. I think that's an important point to look at, because oftentimes we talk about what we pay at the pump, but we also don't look at the implications of when gas prices fall for what we export as well. And we already have a decline in production.
Yeah,
right.
It's been declining.
At August 2015, I think that's the latest numbers I had, the average export price per barrel had fallen some 51% from around $97 to $47 a barrel. So imagine the reduction in overall export revenue, and also by extension government tax revenue. Simultaneously, you have current expenditure increasing year on year, each fiscal year. And while revenues have been increasing, the overall balance has been worsening. You know, you have it moving from around 11 million in fiscal year 12-13 to around 125 million, you know, by the end of 14-15 preliminary numbers. But like Rumile said, I mean, they need to raise the revenue to sort of plug up that hole.
Yeah, because that's the story that a lot of people are missing. If we are continue spending money, our expenditure continues to be high, and the revenues aren't matching that increase, what's going to be happening is that we have to increase our debt, because we have to borrow, in most cases, to finance that spending. So we don't want a situation where our debt levels are extremely high. I mean, we have seen that we went through 2 debt restructurings already, and that's just not a situation you want to put your country in whatsoever.
And keeping with the theme of gas, because I think this is really a tough one for people to understand, just because when you see the prices and how they've fallen everywhere else, the acquisition cost did go down. Right? So it was primarily just the revenue that's being collected by the country that keeps the price close to where it's been, a little bit under $10 for a while.
So from June 2014 to about December of 2015, the price fell somewhere around the nature of 60%. You know, we're talking from about $93 a barrel to about $38 a barrel. It was at the end of December 2015, and now it's hovering around $30 to $31 per barrel. But you have to understand, against the backdrop that we were painting just now, where we have declining export revenues and increasing outlays on current and capital expenditure, you know, perhaps the least disruptive way to fill that revenue shortfall was to maintain gas prices at levels that we were more or less accustomed to, as opposed to increasing another tax on general consumption or earnings and wages.
Now,
But the question may be for some people, how does the cost of fuel factor into everything that we do locally? And is it an equitable distribution of taxes?
I mean, so the cost of fuel factors into private consumption, and it also factors into the production of goods and services. It is an equitable, I mean, it's debatable, but you know, I mean, there's a certain inelasticity about fuel consumption. You know, if you have to commute to work, you will commute to work, whether you're doing it in a private motor vehicle or you're doing it in a bus. You know, if you have to deliver goods, you know, the demand will still remain. So there's a certain inelasticity where fuel is concerned. So it's, you know, again, as I said, keeping the price levels where they were or slightly reduced was probably the least disruptive way of earning additional revenues, as opposed to increasing GST or pay-as-you-earn tax.
Yeah. If you're thinking about the prices as well, how they impacted different items within the economy. In 2015, I believe we had a deflation, which means general prices went down. It's not as dramatic as what happened internationally, but you could see when oil prices reduced, there's a reduction in transportation costs and distribution costs. That assisted the consumers in a certain way, because the bundles that we are buying, the goods that we are buying had reduced in their costs as well. So whereas you might see the benefits in one area, because the government had to take some revenue raising measures or revenue sustaining measures, then you wouldn't necessarily see it at the pump, but you could see it in other places within the economy.
Yeah. I want to stick with this theme just for a bit in terms of looking at additional sources of revenue, because we know this is an important factor. I mean, the Prime Minister has really given full disclosure in terms of looking at not wanting to incur more debt, and understanding that we do have a reduction in oil production. Agriculture took a couple of blows in the past couple of years, and really one of our strongest points is tourism, that has been helping a lot in terms of earning the country money. When you speak about maintaining a price at the pump that people are accustomed to, in other words, you won't feel a fluctuation in how much you spend per month for something, but there would be additional revenue back in the country. What are some options that other developing countries do when in this particular situation to be able to increase the revenue?
I guess revenue in large part is tied to your overall economy, you know, and I think the part of the answer is to try and have the discussion about how can we increase growth, how can we increase output, because I mean your options tend to be along the lines of, are you going to increase debt or are you going to increase taxes? You know, so I think part of the discussion has to be, how do we increase growth so that through a more organic process we can generate the required revenue to sustain the country.
How do you explain this to somebody if you were to use it as an analogy for somebody's salary? Because people, I mean, we talk about this a lot, and when we talk about exports and imports, sometimes it doesn't necessarily translate because we're just used to salary and taxes. That's the language we primarily use, right? So how would you explain it?
In terms of an individual, I believe, and this is something I kind of practice, that every individual should carry themselves much like an economy. What you're bringing in should be more than you're paying out. If you have a large level of debt, you're limited in what you can do. So for anyone out there, a large level of debt isn't ideal.
Yeah.
So you have to make sure that you preserve your income, and in a lot of ways you have to check the expenditure side as well. You have to ensure that you're spending properly. You have to ensure that you don't necessarily are out there splurging on things that you don't need. And then you have to make sure that your revenues are in order and intact and constant and sustainable.
Yeah.
And if there's any chance for you to increase your revenues, maybe a second job, maybe a service you're providing to somebody, that would work as well. You know, just maximizing your potential in that sense. Yeah. That's how I think about it.
Now, I think one of the things that was said probably Marlene said it just now, is looking at how industries are performing and tying that within the national overall picture. Very often we don't do that. So when we look at the conversation of fuel prices, for example, it might be one of the few times that you may hear, well, you know, we had some challenges with shrimp or with citrus and poultry, and so those may be accounting for some of the needs in terms of government, in terms of increased taxation. Is that a part of how you get people to actually understand that everything that happens nationally impacts what, not necessarily what I earn, but what I pay for certain things that we regularly consume?
I mean, you know, it goes back to the previous discussion where we were looking at GDP and national output. You know, it really is an important measure because it's the sum of all goods and services produced on a particular period in a particular place, and that all impacts the household sector, the business sector, and the government sector. They're all intertwined in the financial system and the economy, and one will affect the other. Fuel price will affect the cost of goods. Corn prices will affect the price of chicken, and so on and so forth. So we should pay attention and try to see the linkages within the broader economy.
Yeah. There's just a thought that came to my mind. I recall conversations with the Poultry Association, and a lot of times people don't understand, we don't understand our individual responsibility. When there was the avian flu outbreak, for example, and people couldn't cross on a very simplistic level, their poi or brew, couldn't understand. Why must we adhere to these things? But a lot of times individual actions have a larger impact. We had the avian flu in a couple of farms, had to wipe those out, and we saw a shortage at the end of the year, which also increased our imports and the turkey situation. Yeah, I don't know what you call it, a turkey crisis at the end of the year. The reason I bring this up is because it is important, and this is why we want to have more conversations like these, that people start to realize how our individual role and responsibilities within the country do play a larger role. When we talk about price increases, and this leads me to the second question actually, it talks about how come when the fuel price changes, my bus and taxi fare doesn't? Do I have to own a vehicle in order to get those savings? Who regulates these things? And why is it always that the poor who suffers? And we do have to say these are submitted by our viewers, and they're realistic concerns. So I go back to the everyday impact with this particular question, right?
This is a very interesting question, and in my opinion, I've noticed that our country, we're not a very market-based. I could just from what I've witnessed, we don't swing with the tides sometimes. Sometimes things remain the same. Quite honestly, if you could look at it in retrospect, the bus prices and the taxi fares have been changing significantly over the years. I mean, we're still paying, what, $5 to get to Belmopan, and since God knows when, and that's been for a while. So that has been maintained even in the face of increasing oil prices. Oil prices shot up sky high in 2008. And our fares didn't change as much as during that time as well. So you could say that the producers are taking the brunt of that hit at that time in terms of the taxi providers, the transportation providers. And right now they might be benefiting. And it's almost a trade-off, in what you say. It would be healthier if we would see the impact, if we would notice the impact, because people are becoming more aware of what's going on globally. But you could kind of see there's a trade-off.
We want the reduction when there's a fall in prices, but don't hike it up when the prices go up. We hear it. I mean, we hear this from people.
Well, I mean, generally in economics, there's a saying, it says prices tend to be sticky downwards. So you'll quickly reflect the pass-through of the increase in the cost, but when time come to reduce, it doesn't really work like that, and that tends to be worldwide. The second part of the question, do I have to own a vehicle personally to reap the benefits? You gotta look at cost-benefit analysis where that is concerned. Personally, I mean, you do have additional costs of maintenance, insurance, licensing, etc. So perhaps you'll find that your savings may be outweighed by additional outlays associated with maintenance. So it's a personal decision that you have to make where that is concerned.
Now, Rumile said something earlier about being reflective of markets in general. But when we look at the prices, and it was good that you brought up that prices have not changed significantly, but we complain also about service. And in other places, if the service is to improve in any way, shape, or form, it means that there's a built-in the kind of formula that they employ to say we have to replace so many buses, we have to improve stations, we have to do this, and it's built into your costs. Do you think it's something that is it a planning strategy? Perhaps when the public transportation is tied into so much of what the municipality provides, as opposed to individual private providers, whether it is for bus or for taxis, that regulate the prices.
I think,
Go ahead, you could have that one.
all right.
You could have a first crack at it.
So you're asking, is it a private versus? I think it really depends on the size of the market that you're serving, and the margins that are available from providing the service. At times it's a bit unfair to compare Belize with other countries, because in terms of population, we don't have the size of market to match. And then you say, well, but similar Caribbean peers, who have similar population, well, they don't have the sort of land area that we have. So I think, the output that is provided there maybe, I don't know, because it's not publicly available information, but I'm hypothesizing that it may be reflective of the sort of margins that you get and market size.
And in general, there's this idea in economics that governments aren't, I'm not by any way condemning our government in any case, but governments aren't terribly efficient in terms of providing services. That's why it would be better to have most of these services in the hands of private operators. When you have these things being available, then private operators are seeing to it that their business is flourishing. They're looking at their margins more than anything else, while the government is providing a service that is generally, we can't say totally free, but in the most cases, they're not profit based, and they're not looking at in terms of improving the service to that certain extent. They're just knowing that they're providing it to people, whereby a private agent looks more at his profits, looks more at how he could gain more profits, and that's where you would see those instances where there would be increased newer buses or what have you, in order to get that market share, however small the market may be. But that's generally the case. Huh?
Now, you know, it's interesting because when there was the hike in the gas, in the fuel price, William and I had a very thorough conversation about how in other parts of the world, a lot of people tried to cut their costs. They tried to change routines of driving around, or they would ride bikes instead and take more public transportation. We don't necessarily see that type of reaction in Belize. We continue to absorb the costs or the expenses, even though sometimes it's really not very manageable for individual households. How important is it that we become, I think you said the term earlier, market response, or you were speaking about the responsiveness to what is happening, even as individuals in our own livelihoods. That's perhaps a way to, we need to do some cost saving measures. That's how they
Well, I mean, so you spoke about linkages and individual preferences and effects. I mentioned that there's a certain amount of inelasticity where fuel consumption is concerned, and you got to look at the availability of substitutes, you know. So perhaps a person would say, I will continue to drive to work as opposed to taking a bus, or I will continue taking the bus as opposed to renting a room somewhere and cutting out my commute altogether. But they will make the cutbacks, whether consciously or unconsciously, in other portions of their consumption.
And perhaps they don't do it in transport, but they do it in other areas. Right. Interesting, yeah.
And as you can see in other parts of the world, a response may be somewhat easier. In terms of, I think in America, when gas prices went extremely high, you could see that there was a substitution effect whereby the everyday users use more hybrid vehicles, more smaller vehicles in terms of using the large, the F-150s, the SUVs, what have you. It's easier in that type of economy. Now, whereby in Belize, when it comes time to change a vehicle, it's a serious expense that you go through, though. So maybe in those places, the response to these situations are facilitated in a way by their markets.
Now, I guess the point that Marlene is getting at is, how do we get people to start looking at alternatives? Globally, we're hearing all kinds of conversations, and I guess because we purchase, for example, most of our electricity from Mexico, we don't think about the real costs of certain things, whether it's environmentally or economically. Where you have their pushes, Rumile spoke about downsizing your car, for example, or going to flex fuel or something of that sort. How do we get people to look at alternatives in terms of making better choices on a regular basis when you're faced with some of the challenges economically?
I think that your own personal budget constraint forces you to be innovative. Coming back to another old adage, it seems like I'm Mr. Proverbs today, but they say necessity is the mother of invention. You know, so when you're budget constrained, whether it be again at the individual or household level, whether it be at the business level or at the government level, when you only have X amount of revenue, you know, if you don't want to take on more debt, you're going to have to be innovative in coming up with ways to adjust your expenditure so that you remain in a surplus or even position.
And I guess what I was trying to get at, perhaps to articulate it a little differently, you see global movements being born out of certain movements in certain markets, where enough people start feeling strongly about certain things that you actually have a kind of a revolution within a particular sector of a community. And when we were talking about bicycling, for example, you're not seeing an increase in bicycles. You're not seeing certain things.
So bicycling is perhaps not the greatest example because bicycles have always been popular here in Belize.
No, but
I don't know, but in terms of things, basic things as changing to more energy efficient light bulbs. You know,
Right.
a lot of people have taken that step as an effort to try and reduce power consumption or the cost of lighting your house. Switching again to healthier alternatives when it comes to food, that's an example of consumers sort of advocating for, this is the type of good or service that I want. So that, I guess.
In general, it ties into the last conversation that we had here when we were with you guys. It's education. A lot of people, like we said, this kind of discourse is necessary because a lot of people don't understand what certain things mean in terms of their personal, in terms of the impact on their lives. So they will look at the government and say, oh, all right, our revenues are short. And to them, that means nothing. So in terms of the general understanding of topics, staying in tune with the news and understanding the news in general, we're trying to get it started. No?
I mean, we even see this with SIB, with the Statistical Institute. They produce and publicize their statistics very often. However, I think two things we often miss. One, we don't break down the numbers enough for people. When you're talking in percentages, and it's very difficult for people to understand. One, and two, trends are important to know. There will be a time where sugar production will be down because that's not the time for sugar, and there'll be a time where it'll be up. There are very few places that people can go to be able to break down this information. What is your advice to people in terms of, yes, paying attention to the news and being able to get that information, but also trying to find a way to digest it for their own selves and understand it?
That's a very interesting question because one time I could remember getting into a taxi, and this man was telling me how my economy works, and I was there like, I studied, it's not like that, and he was insisting. So sometimes there's a lot of misinformation all over the place. Quite honestly, there are individuals out there with this knowledge, and there are individuals out there that are willing to share. Like we, for example, us coming up here today, we're willing to share. There's the classroom setting in which you can learn all of that, but quite honestly, it might sound kind of silly in a way, but the internet has a lot of information, and you could get to reliable sites in which to understand certain economic events. You could look at probably the news on the IMF websites, on the World Bank websites. These try to break down a little bit of that information and all of that. And if all else fails, I always tell my students this: you could refer to Google. you might not have, you have to find the sites that are, you have to, because you'll get a wealth of information, but not all the information is reliable. But sometimes you can find good answers up there as well.
So let's go back to one of the emerging issues. And this wasn't one provided by our viewers, but just to be able to capitalize on what's happening at this time. We've been talking about the correspondent banking relationships. There's been so much conversation taking place in this region on the impact that it will have. Other than when people start to hear about credit card payments or access to particular services, that's the only time people start to put it into context for themselves. Why is this such a critical situation for the country?
Well, it's a critical situation for banks in the entire Latin America and Central America and Caribbean region. I would say I don't think there's any bank executives that don't have this topic on their mind. Why? Because simply that's how we connect with the rest of the world and how we do international transactions and international business. It's how we facilitate international trade payments and receive payments for export. So it's integral to us being connected to the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. So it also means, for example, not only for us to be able to purchase, let's say, via the internet, but for tourists to pay for services that they intend to access once here.
It's receiving payment for citrus exports. Mm-hmm. It's if you're a consultant working for an international firm, being able to receive that payment. It's sending tuition to pay for your brother or sister's college fees. It's sending payments to pay for the import of a vehicle. It's so integral to us being connected to the rest of the world, and I guess that is why such a level of import has been placed on it by all stakeholders in the country and the financial system.
And you can see that our country, we depend on imports and exports. We depend on imports for a whole lot. We produce using imports, we consume using imports. Imagine, as Chris said, imagine if the citrus industry can't receive payments from abroad. What's going to happen to their workers? What's going to happen to their families? So we're not creating a panic here by any means, but it's a serious topic that we need to delve into and get a full grasp of.
Yeah. And, seeing the team that went off last week to be able to lobby on behalf of the country was really, I think, to underscore to people how important the issue is. However, we're still not necessarily at a point where relationships are on the mend. One of the things we heard yesterday in the press conference was part of the advice given to the Prime Minister was to seek to do business with other banks other than the major banks. So let's talk about what the possibilities are with that and whether or not that makes transactions more difficult or why that wasn't an option explored in the beginning.
So I think you got to step back for a minute and look at the broader context in which this discussion is happening.
Yeah.
Belize as a jurisdiction made several steps to strengthen our overall AML CFT framework.
Anti-money laundering.
Anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism framework. So much so that in May 2015 we were certified as largely compliant with all the Financial Action Task Force key and core regulations. So we've done a lot as a country to strengthen our anti-money laundering framework. And as individual institutions, efforts are ongoing and continue to strengthen individual institutions' AML framework. So I think, putting that context and seeing the seriousness and import that the government, the Prime Minister, the Governor of the Central Bank has placed on this issue, I think that it's very likely that soon other banks that have not necessarily previously transacted with this jurisdiction will consider it.
And part of the, I'm going to talk about that because I still want to take it back to individual impact. We had bank representatives here talking about compliance with the AML regulation and encouraging people really to come in and update their accounts and understanding that the way we do business with our banks will change. There'll be more regulations, there's more information necessary, and it has caused some concern from people, like, why do you need to know why I'm withdrawing X sum and I used to do it in the past? But this is tied right back into issues that, to the larger issue of correspondent banking relationships, the severing we saw there.
I think, so let me just
if you string it all together for us, yeah.
Like, so on the individual impact side, I think the main idea, or one of the main themes or ideas behind the regulation is for banks to know your customers. KYC. KYC is kind of drilled over and over. So KYC, know your customer.
Okay.
So it's for institutions to get to know their customers, to verify that you actually reside at this address, to verify that your income is legitimate. And to be honest, knowing your customer has additional benefits. I mean, if we know that William usually only withdraws at X ATM, and then we see strange withdrawals on, for example, down in Toledo or in Corozal, and William doesn't normally, he didn't tell us he was planning to be there. It could also help us to, on an individual basis, more quickly detect fraud. Mm-hmm. So know your customer. While it may seem cumbersome initially, there's additional benefits to knowing that this is actually William or Marlene doing a transaction that is a genuine and legitimate transaction.
Yeah.
And it also keeps us in compliance
Right.
with the new regulations for
Right.
AML.
Right.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because for some people, one of the major kickbacks or pushbacks that they've had is actually with credit cards. Whether you're going right over to Chetamal or some other place, and they say, for example, inform the bank or the card might not work.
I mean, that's a bank-to-bank
Yeah.
policy. Each bank will have their own
Yeah.
policies on that. So, you know.
But is that a part of the same compliance?
I think it would be more a part of fraud,
Protection.
fraud protection in general. I mean, you're looking at patterns and which countries are deemed more high risk for credit card fraud. And each bank will have their own individual policies relating to credit card usage and
Yeah.
limiting possible instances of fraud.
Yeah. So, in terms of the impacts of the current situation when it comes to the correspondent banking relationships, how does it affect the country currently? How does it affect business, the private sector, and also the larger picture?
So it is a concern, continues to be a concern, but as was mentioned in the press conference yesterday, all banks currently have a correspondent
Yeah.
banking arrangement. So it is an area of concern. Efforts are being made on all fronts to address and deal with the situation, and I'm confident that, you know, we will resolve it.
Yeah.
In
So
due
we're
course.
not
and what-
having any impact.
And what we generally don't understand is that correspondent banking, individual banks have a correspondent bank to deal with different types of transactions. So it's not one correspondent bank and you lose it and all is lost. So they might have a correspondent bank for credit cards, they might have a correspondent bank for transfers and what have you. So it's not like, all right, we lost this relationship, no, we can't do any type of international transactions whatsoever. So that's what people need to kind of grasp there as well. No?
Well, gentlemen, we want to thank you both for joining us again. And of course, we encourage viewers to submit questions, and then we can invite them back and quiz them on the spot.
Look at the excitement on their faces when we say that. What is one thing, just based on what is currently in the national conversation, that you think you'd like to tell people or educate them about?
You gotta go with it. You want me to take that one? For me, it's more of a cultural reaction towards economics in that sense. I'm very concerned with the fact that I think over the years people seem to be of the opinion that it's the government that should drive your economy. That's my issue. Whereby it's the entrepreneur and it's the local business that should be pushing your economy. We have a situation right now in our that where there's excess liquidity. There's high levels of excess liquidity within our financial system, and if we had that push, that entrepreneurial push, to get new businesses out there, and to not only get them out there and do it in the proper way, have your financials together, having your documents well presented, so when you go to the bank, you have your business plan and your financials. So when you go to the bank, you'll be able to get a loan, because that situation, to me, culturally and how Belizeans think about the economy, I think that is more important, and quite honestly, that warrants a very long discussion. So we would really go into that now, but the excess liquidity situation kind of ties into that in and of itself, and that's something that people should be aware of at this point in time.
You know, that's a very good topic that we will have to bring you back on now. But we're out of time at this point. We want to thank you for joining us. And once again, we remind you that if you have questions related to the economy, you can submit them to us, and we'll be sure to convince Chris and Rumile to join us again to respond to them. All right? We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, it's to be joined by the Scouts Association of Belize. So stay tuned.